Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for tuning in to my YouTube channel. So great to see everyone who's coming in and hitting the subscribe button. Thank you so much for that. Today, we've got a really interesting story, one that I was just enthralled with after a while. It is definitely one of those books that's a real page turner, and I'm not saying that because David's looking at me right now. I'm saying that because it's true. I'm really happy to have Dr. David Tuck on with me today to talk about his book, The Wireless Operator, which I have my copy here. And if you want your copy, I have it pinned in the chat, ready for you to go to Icon Books and also find out where your local bookseller is. David, how are you?
Yeah, I'm doing pretty well, John. Very much looking forward to our chat. I'm a big fan of the show. Thanks for having me. I'm really looking
No,
forward to it.
thank you. Thank you so much. I appreciate that. Just so everyone knows who's tuning in, David is obviously a writer and an entrepreneur. The Wireless Operator is his debut book and details the story of his cousin, Harold Derber. David was born in New York and has lived in England and France. He now calls Brookline, Massachusetts home. And as I said, a link is, I don't know which direction it is. I think it's that way in the chat, pinned there to the Wireless Operator and all kinds of other stuff. So, David, what made you want to get into writing your first book?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's funny because never in 1,000 years did I think I'd be writing about the dawn of the drug trade. As you mentioned, I'm a technology entrepreneur by background, although I come from a family of writers, and I sold my technology business in 2023. And it was a chance to think about what's next and maybe kick back a little bit. And I was doing some family genealogy research as a hobby, and I was exchanging emails with a distant cousin, and towards the end of the chat, he said, "Oh, by the way, you should look into our mutual cousin, a fellow named Harold Derber, who was a soldier of fortune, major gun runner and drug trafficker. He was shot down by a professional hitman in Miami. And I didn't know if it was one of those bits of family folklore that sort of took on a life of its own, or if there was any truth to it. And so I checked in with another cousin, and she was like, "Oh yeah, he used to run guns for Castro." Everyone knew that. And so with that, I was intrigued and started off with an internet search. And amazingly, there was almost nothing on the internet. And I thought, okay, maybe this is a dead end. And then started digging into the old newspaper articles. And before I knew it, I was looking into foreign national archives. I was able to track down some of his criminal associates, as well as the undercover agents who pursued him. I was in correspondence with MI5 and the Israeli government. And before I knew it, I was completely enthralled. And I realized, okay, this is a bit more than a party anecdote. There's a really cool piece of undiscovered history. And then I thought, okay, when I sold my business, I had to sign a non-compete agreement, but thankfully writing about gun running and drug trafficking wasn't covered in my non-compete. And so I thought, okay, this is something I can, put some energy into. Spent a couple of years doing the research and writing, and really glad I was able to bring the story to readers with the launch of The Wireless Operator.
What was it like going down that rabbit hole, David, for you personally, where you're now, you've probably never seen yourself as, sending an email to someone in MI5 or something like that, and now you're doing that. Explain that to us of how you really felt writing this or researching it, even just getting that initial research in, because you're going places you never expected to go with this one person.
Yeah, absolutely. In many ways, it harked back to my training and career as a scientist, because you're trying to collect these various lines of evidence. And particularly when you're writing about espionage and organized crime, there's a lot of obfuscation and misdirection and destroyed files. And so trying to get at the core truth can sometimes prove really challenging. So in the same way that if you're testing a model or a theory, you want to sort of accumulate multiple lines of evidence in order to have a certain confidence level around a claim, I often found that I needed 2 or 3 independent accounts in order to feel confident in some of the claims we're able to make in the book. And I try to draw a bright distinction between what's informed speculation and what's established fact. And then there's also the thrill of that discovery. You can sort of dig into the archives and be going through old boxes for days or days and not find anything. And then you discover this little thread and you pull on it, and then some amazing new findings fall out. So that's been enormously gratifying. And I think what was also really interesting is that, as I mentioned, there was almost nothing on the internet. And then you go into the archives and the freedom of information requests and the oral histories, and this whole world emerges. And so for me, it was also sort of a romantic hark back to the before times when people actually had to, do primary research from paper sources. And so it just reminded me that there's a whole world of undiscovered history, waiting for people that have the will to find it.
Yeah, I never thought of that when you were speaking of how this is going back to our analog ways of doing research and getting into the archives and actually feeling the paper instead of looking at digitized versions of it. It's almost like we're kind of separated from that now in some ways, sadly.
Yeah, yeah, and it's amazing because I did a freedom of information request for his immigration file, and it was 2,400 pages. And part of that also included some recorded, what they called Edison records, so basically vinyl records that were
Mm.
recording of his interviews with the immigration authorities. And so I'm working now with the INS in order to recover the transcripts from those recordings. And so, yeah, we're going back to a very analog world.
What was it like hearing his voice for the first time as a researcher?
It's really interesting because he grew up in Manchester, England, but he served in the British Merchant Navy starting as a young teenager, first with the Dutch merchant fleet and then the Norwegian merchant fleet. So a lot of his coming of age was actually with, very salty Dutch and Norwegian seamen. And then he spent the bulk of his adult life in the U.S. And then Miami, Florida, and South America, Suriname, Colombia, Mexico, Honduras, Nicaragua, before returning to the US. And so I wasn't sure what to expect when I first heard his voice. And he definitely has a Manc accent, so it's very clear that he's from Northern England, but has a sort of sing-song quality to it as well that sounds slightly Norwegian or Scandinavian. So it's one of those accents that's not immediately easy to place because it's sort of an amalgamation of different
Mm.
accents. But he definitely has, I would say, a proper Northern British accent.
Mm. May have helped him from time to time to come across as maybe slightly different than what he was behind the scenes.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, he committed massive financial fraud across the globe, and I'm fairly certain that projecting himself as the debonair British gentleman with the accent and the pencil mustache and the pinstripe suit, helped him gain the confidence of some of his victims, no doubt.
Why did he want to, as a young man, why did he want to get out of Manchester and learn a trade basically and just get out of his home place?
Yeah, so he was born in 1926. So he was 13 when the war broke out in 39. And Manchester was a particularly wretched place to experience the war. So, in addition to the Blitz, which Manchester was heavily subjected to as a major industrial and transportation hub, but also rationing, he was evacuated as a 13-year-old to Blackpool. And Manchester was also the site of the British Union of Fascists with Sir Oswald Mosley. So there was, and actually, the British Union of Fascists was headquartered just on the outskirts of Cheetham Hill, which was the Jewish quarter of Manchester. So there were a lot of clashes between the black shirts and the Jewish population in Cheetham Hill. And one piece of history that I discovered that very few people know is that there were Jewish internment camps in England. So about 8,000 Jews were interned in Manchester, Middlesex, Surrey, Isle of Man, and many were deported to Canada and Australia. So, although he was never detained, members of his family were, and some were deported to the Isle of Man, and his family members also had to go before the internment tribunals. So, given all that, it was an incredibly wretched experience growing up, and the family was really quite poor. So they ran a market stall for leather goods, and there wasn't a big sort of leather clothing demand at the time of the war. Plus, the clothes rations made it really difficult for them to make a living. And so he signed up to become a wireless operator or a radio officer in the British Merchant Navy at the young age of 16, and then shipped off with the Dutch merchant fleet to serve in the Battle of the Atlantic at the tender age of 17. So his birth name was Hyman Took for Derber. And so you have to imagine young Hyman Took for Derber, 5'6", serving as the only non-Dutchman on a Dutch merchant ship, with these sailors that are 20, 30 years at sea with, scars across their faces, these really, salty, seasoned sailors serving in the Battle of the Atlantic. So I think it was very much a case of out of the frying pan and into the fire. So he escapes, this wretched upbringing in Manchester, only to find himself serving with the merchant fleet in the middle of the Battle of the Atlantic.
Did he ever see any kind of traumatic event on the high seas, or was a ship sunk or anything like that while he was on board?
It's really interesting. So he claimed, and I want to emphasize claimed, that he was torpedoed 5 times. And I scoured the records to see if there was any account of any of his ships experiencing a direct hit. I could not find any. So, as we'll get into, he also had a tendency to exaggerate quite a bit. So, it's unclear if that was another sort of fanciful exaggeration or if there was any truth to it. So, although there's no record that he experienced any direct hits, he was involved in a number of naval conflicts, which I detail in the book as well. So, he shipped off in 1943. So, at that point, the Enigma had been broken. So, the Allies were able to improve their naval defense tactics. The convoy system was introduced, and the convoy tactics against the U-boats was also coming stronger into play. So it was much safer serving the Battle of the Atlantic in 43 compared to 42. But I was able to find at least 3 accounts of naval conflict he experienced, although no direct hits.
What's he doing on VE Day? Where's he at?
Yeah, so he had the fun of being in New York for VE Day. As we'll get into, he has a major talent for finding where the best hotspots are. And so he was in Times Square for VE Day. I was able to document that. And you have to imagine going from just a miserable experience growing up poor in Manchester, England, to experiencing, all the joy and pomp of the U.S. and New York City in particular. So I think it was really an eye-opening experience for him, and probably sort of set off his love affair with the States.
Do you think this kind of service for him really ignited a sense of adventure and also uh, living on the edge in a way? You don't know what's going to happen from day to day. I get that sense from reading that he's just kind of like he's really into this lifestyle of just living on the edge, or just trying to find the next fix, if you will. I don't mean to put that in a perspective of a drug smuggler, but it's that dopamine rush.
Yeah, he had an absolute lust for adventure and danger. So I had the good fortune to um, find the memoirs of his lover, and she describes him as being absolutely addicted to danger, and he would seek out every opportunity that he could. I don't get into too much psychological speculation in the book, but I do wonder if growing up during the very harrowing period of World War II and experiencing the Blitz and the evacuation and black shirts, and serving with the Merchant Navy when he was only 17, somehow created a psychological trigger that would set him on a later course for pursuing danger. There's some psychological literature that danger seekers very often came from a traumatic childhood. So I can't prove that definitively, but it couldn't have helped. I mean, starting off serving, a very harrowing war at the age of 17 probably set him on a course where he was looking for adventure for the rest of his life.
Yeah, I think of him as being like those guys who started like hot rods in after the war and things like that, because they just wanted the speed of being back in an aircraft, or doing something like that, feeling like they were on the edge again. And I thought of him, or I thought of them when I was reading about him, where it's like it seems like it's the same kind of person that's just wants to, they survived a war and now they want to push themselves to the edge again and see what happens.
Yeah, absolutely, and he proved that throughout his criminal career, where here from one historical period to the next, he's sort of like the Zelig of the 20th century war history, where he's finding every major conflict and just sort of veering from one battle to the next.
After the Second World War, what is the next big event that we see him wanting to be involved with or trying to be involved with.
Yeah, so he stays on with the British Merchant Navy after the war and is involved in some low-scale contraband smuggling. But then the next major state conflict after the war was the Arab-Israeli War, which broke out in '48 after Israel declared independence. And the state of Israel sent out a call to the Jewish diaspora asking for volunteers. And so he, along with a lot of other Jewish as well as non-Jewish sailors, volunteered to serve in the Arab-Israeli War. And we might know that at the outbreak of the war, the US, UK, and UN implemented an arms embargo against Israel and the neighboring Arab states with the intention of creating a level playing field in the hopes of driving the parties to a negotiated peace. And Israel at the outbreak was very heavily outgunned. So they initiated what would become the largest illegal arms smuggling operation in world history. And so Derber, along with a number of his other naval volunteers, were charged to smuggle illegal arms into the nascent state of Israel in order to prosecute the war. And amazingly, the vast majority of those weapons actually came from Nazi surplus that Stalin had seized in Czechoslovakia. And so you have this very incongruous situation of British sailors smuggling Nazi weapons seized by Stalin through the British arms blockade to arm Israel to fight the Arabs. It's just wonderful how history creates these, complete paradoxes. And what was really amazing is that the blockade was manned by fellow British sailors. So these were Royal Navy sailors, and so you have other British sailors attempting to charge through the blockade that's being manned by their fellow sailors that they were fighting shoulder to shoulder with just a few years earlier. And it's at this point that he meets his lifelong friend and occasional business partner, a fellow named Ray Adiel, who was most likely also the air attaché from Israel to Panama, and they embark on a lifelong friendship. So after the armistice and the conclusion of the Arab-Israeli War, he discovers this amazing arms smuggling loophole where, because Germany had imposed a arms export ban, they had a huge amount of surplus that they were unable to offload, but they had secretly carved out an exemption for providing arms to Israel as part of their penance of the war. So Derber arranged for this smuggling operation where he was attempting to smuggle Nazi surplus weapons through Israel onward to the dictatorial government of the Dominican Republic. So he was essentially whitewashing German weapons onward to the government of Rafael Trujillo. And I recently, it's not detailed in the book, but after the book was published, I got some additional FBI documents that detailed the arms that he was seeking to provide for Trujillo, and it reads like, the armamentarium for a small military. I mean, it's clear he was planning to be one of the major arms providers for the DR, and I think the line of credit was $41 million in early 1950s dollars. So that would be about $400 million today in order to procure weapons for the DR. And so at this stage, as we mentioned, he's sort of, has been, smitten with the thrill of illegal smuggling. And he continues to do basically like a career sampling in different forms of smuggling and trafficking through the 1950s, trying to take advantage of this massive opportunity to smuggle surplus German weapons. But he also dabbles in stock fraud and corporate espionage, and that's all before he permanently relocates back to the US in the late 1950s.
Doesn't this just show how crazy the early Cold War period is, where there's so much going on? A lot of us discuss the Second World War or whatever. And then when you jump ahead to like Korea and the Cold War and involvement with Korea, there's so many other small things going on, and the Arab-Israeli war, but there's so many other small things going on where arms are being sent back and forth in different places. Money is exchanging hands between different people for various reasons, whether they're good, bad, or indifferent. It's amazing when we look at how much of a puzzle the Cold War era is, even for people who are just, they own a boat or a ship and they have the ability to transport things.
Yeah, absolutely. So I like to think of it as resetting the pieces on the chessboard. So the first
Wow.
conflict is over. We have this huge surplus of weapons on the continent, and the Cold War powers are now, reassembling the pieces in preparation for the next round of the game.
Mm.
And what I came to appreciate through writing the book is the central role that the British Merchant Navy played in this, because they were a private force. They're not a military force, yet they have deep access across all the world's ports. The sailors themselves, although they're civilian, they're quasi-military. They have titles and ranks and the discipline that comes with that. And so they played a really central role in a lot of the contraband smuggling in preparation for the sort of outbreak of the Cold War.
When does Harold start to see people who are impacted by this as people in need, so to speak, where he's seeing refugees coming into these environs, and they need to be taken out or they need to be moved to a new location? He's moving arms and equipment, but when does he start to see that people are also needed to be moved out of these areas?
Yeah, so the illegal arms smuggling network for the Arab-Israeli war is actually a outgrowth of the Jewish refugee smuggling operation that preceded the Arab-Israeli war. So we might know that there was a immigration ban on bringing uh, Jewish folks to Israel prior to the war, and so there was a massive illegal refugee smuggling operation, detailed in the Exodus and other excellent books. And so that smuggling network was largely co-opted for arms smuggling during the war. He doesn't really show, or at least I haven't found any record of him showing any affinity with refugee smuggling until his later work with Fidel Castro and the Cuban refugee smuggling network. So I think at this stage, his motivation is largely monetary and for thrill seeking. He doesn't take on sort of a humanitarian veneer to his smuggling until his later work for the Cuban cause.
So why does Harold end up in Miami?
Yeah, so he does a brief layover in New York. So he moves first to New York with his Israeli friend Ray Adiel that he met in Israel, and they take up in Morningside Heights near Columbia University. And I wanted to mention New York just because there's a really colorful anecdote there where they befriend a young film student who had just graduated from Hofstra University and was on his way to start film school at UCLA, and they produced his first two movies. So Derber and his friend Adiel produced this young film student's first two films. One was a softcore porn film, and the other one was like a cowboy nudie film. And that young film student was Francis Ford Coppola. So they produced Coppola's first two films, amazingly enough. I
Wow.
reached out to his people and haven't had a comment yet, but I thought that was a colorful part of the story.
Yeah.
Um, and so then the Bay of Pigs happens in the spring of '61, and true to his calling to pursue where the next conflict was, he thought, okay, this is a great opportunity, and moves down to Miami to see what opportunities he can find in the Cold War in the Caribbean. He charters a luxury cruise ship called the Calypso liner, which runs between Miami Pier 3 and the Bahamas. And then, and still to this day, once the ship is beyond the 3 mile limit into international waters, you're allowed to have gambling on the ship. So he sets up a floating casino on the ship. And this is right after the Havana Mafia got kicked out by Castro.
Mhm.
So the likes of Meyer Lansky, Morris Landsberg, Mike McClaney set up their gambling operation on Derber's boat, and so he has the opportunity to start mingling with the who's who of the Jewish mafia in Miami. And it's at this stage that he meets his love of his life, essentially. Her name is Sari Leslie, and she has an identical twin. They become the entertainment directors on his ship, but little known to him, she's using it as a cover to do her contract work, most likely for the CIA, to smuggle cash and corporate documents out of Havana. So this is at the time that Castro is nationalizing all of the U.S. subsidiaries and seizing U.S. hard currency. And so her mission is to smuggle out the cash and the documents. And so by day, or even by evening, she's the entertainment director on a ship. And then at night, she's smuggling these items out of Cuba. And so they trade up for another luxury cruise ship called the Empress of Bahamas. But the Miami cruise industry is in a absolute doldrums. So with the outbreak of the Cuban Missile Crisis and the general growth of Cold War tensions in the Caribbean, very few people are thinking about going to Miami, for a relaxing holiday.
Yeah.
So there's almost no tourism in Miami, and so they're having a lot of trouble keeping the boat afloat. And it's at this time that a fellow named James Donovan is sent in order to negotiate for the release of the Bay of Pigs prisoners. After the Bay of Pigs invasion, actually 1,100 members of the invasion force were captured and held prisoner in the Isle of Pines, which is a remote island off of Cuba. And the White House wanted to negotiate for their release, but they needed to have deniable separation from the Kennedy administration. So they sent down Donovan. Actually, you might know Donovan. He's the character played by Steven Spielberg in the movie The Bridge of Spies. So he was the
Mm.
general counsel for the OSS and would later go on to be sort of a fixer for the CIA. So he goes down there and he negotiates with Castro for the release of the Bay of Pigs prisoners, and he's successful. But they need a private boat in order to return back the Bay of Pigs prisoners. I think you see where this is going. So my cousin Harold Derber sends a telegram to JFK offering his cruise ship to transport back the Bay of Pigs prisoners. It's perfect. It's got amenities and accommodations. It's in the Caribbean. It's a private boat, so it has deniable separation from the White House. And so they accept his offer, and he's approved to transport back the Bay of Pigs prisoners. But then for some reason, it doesn't go through. I think either Fidel wanted to transport the prisoners by plane instead, or they might have done a background check and discovered some of his mafia entanglements. And so they rescind the offer. And he says, well, that's okay. I'm going to go ahead and do it anyway. And so he meets with the Cuban transportation minister in Mexico City, and he signs an exclusive agreement to provide the only transportation out of Cuba. And this is really significant because this is at the time of the Kennedy travel embargo. And so there was no private transportation out of Cuba. Yet at the same time, the White House had granted 250,000 Cubans with US visas. And once they received their visas, they were blacklisted. They had their ration book seized. They were fired from their jobs. And so the White House had created this humanitarian crisis where there were 250,000 Cubans who were ostracized from Cuban society, but had no way to leave because the embargo essentially trapped them on the island. And so Derber saw the financial opportunity of a lifetime to provide transport for these refugees. But the Kennedy administration says, well, you can't do that because of the travel embargo. And he said, well, actually, I'm a British subject. I'm not an American subject. So the travel embargo doesn't apply to me. And so he attempts to smuggle back these Cuban refugees. And that's when the full weight of the CIA and the State Department come crashing down on him. And he's harassed across the Caymans, across the Bahamas. He finally takes up operation in Jamaica, where he does his first successful run to smuggle the Cuban refugees.
Didn't he have to? I thought there was part of the story where he also had to try to land somewhere. I can't remember what island it was. They were flying him in. He was kind of like hopping from one island to another, and they couldn't land because they couldn't let people off plane because people were out there basically wanting to beat him up, kill him, do something. Like his name
Yeah,
had already
so
gotten around.
he was en route from Cuba to Jamaica with a layover in the Caymans, and so as he
Mhm.
was landing in the Cayman Islands, a crowd of 300 people appeared on the airstrip and overpowered the local police and charged his plane and drove and drove cars and trucks to block his flight and the connecting flight, and essentially made it impossible for him to disembark and catch his connecting flight to Jamaica. So he left and returned to Havana, and then the crowd immediately dispersed. So there was a lot of speculation from the Cuban government that it was actually the CIA that had orchestrated this mob in order to frustrate Derber's efforts in the Caribbean. I think it also highlights the role that a lot of the British Crown colonies played during
Mhm.
that part of Cold War history. But it was one of his first glimpses that the U.S. government was going to go to some extreme lengths to frustrate his refugee transportation project. And so he does eventually make it to Jamaica, and they do a successful, and he's still harassed. And in Jamaica, he's brutalized by Jamaican police and sent to prison there. But he's eventually successful to smuggle 2 dozen Cubans out of Cuba to Key West.
Yeah, that gets him front page news almost in America, right? Where that whole court battle becomes an ordeal of, was he allowed to even step foot in the United States? And he said, "Well, I was asked to be taken off the boat. I was asked to step off the boat by the officers."
Yeah, it's crazy. So the whole story was front page news in the Miami Herald for weeks on end, and the whole city and state were following his exploits. In part because he was sticking it in the eye of the Kennedy administration. So he does this successful test run with 2 dozen Cubans, and they're not sure what to charge him with because he wasn't a U.S. subject, so he wasn't subject to the travel ban. So they charge him with these ridiculous misdemeanor charges, including reckless operation of a boat and failure to give the port 24 hours notice, which is absurd considering that they had launched a concerted CIA and State Department suppression campaign across the Caribbean, and had sent agents after him, and these were the best charges they could come up with. The charges were eventually dropped, and they charge him with presenting false registration papers for the boat. That ends in a mistrial. The second trial is dismissed, and they don't know what to do with him. So they deport him as a national security risk without ever specifying publicly what exactly that national security risk was. And then he has to, there's a very important romantic juncture in the book where he has this passionate love affair with Sari, who's doing the covert work for the agency, and he has to decide. She has to decide whether or not to uh, continue on this madcap adventure and join him in exile, or go back home to Bradenton, Florida, to return to her small children. And she decides on the latter. Derber's deported to the UK, and then his smuggling operation takes on an entirely new dimension in the next episode.
Yeah, it absolutely does. Reminder to everyone in the live chat again, thank you for being here, everybody. You can find a link to the wireless operator uh, in the chat. It is pinned in the top of the chat, and it takes you to Icon Books, where they will list out wherever you are in the world where you can find a copy of the book. And they also give you a nice little search option to find your local bookstore so that you can use them. And hopefully you get a copy of the book today. But if not, it's a great Valentine's Day gift. There is a love story involved in this.
Absolutely.
So please check that out. Again, it's pinned at the top of the chat on that side of the screen. David, how does Derber get involved in the marijuana trade?
Yeah. So he is deported to England in '64, and he stays there for very brief time. And at this point, he's banned from the US, most of the British colonies. I think he has no love for the UK. So he travels to Latin America, first Suriname, and then Mexico, and later Honduras. And he lost all of his savings through this Cuban refugee smuggling operation. And so he takes up trade as a boat captain and lobster farmer, actually, in Mexico and then Colombia. And in the book, I have some of the photos of him from that period, and he's completely let himself go. So you have to imagine, a year ago he was wearing pinstripes and cufflinks with his pencil mustache, and now he's completely disheveled. His hair is completely unkempt, and he's working as a lobster boat captain in Mexico.
Yeah.
And he's basically eking out an existence on bank fraud and boat theft. And then something really remarkable happens. I should mention he serves jail time in Honduras, Mexico, and Colombia throughout this period for various forms of financial fraud and boat hijacking. And then something really extraordinary happens. In 1970, President Nixon signs the Controlled Substances Act, which was an attempt to rationalize all of America's disparate drug laws into one coherent statute. And in doing so, they nullified all of the previous drug laws, including the 1922 Narcotics Import Export Act. And in doing so, they made a huge error because they accidentally nullified the law that made it illegal to have drugs in international waters. And so overnight, because of this slip up, it became legal to have drugs, even by the ton load, on the high seas. And Derber realizes that this is the smuggling opportunity of a lifetime. So he collects his fleet of boats and begins what is called the mothership trade. So Derber is credited with being the first one to exploit this legal loophole and pioneering the mothership method of drug importation, where you take a cargo freighter, fill it with drugs, and then park it in the Atlantic, at least 3 miles from shore, where you're in international waters, arrange for the drug transfer to happen mid-ocean, and then have those smaller pickup boats deliver the contraband to the US. So from the perspective of the mothership captain, that drug transfer is completely legal. And so he's able to exploit this loophole, later called the mothership loophole, to import vast quantities of marijuana into the country. So I estimate that he was importing somewhere between 700 and 2,000 tons of marijuana into the country per year, which would have made him the largest marijuana trafficker in the country. And it's remarkable because if we look at marijuana consumption in the US, in the late 1960s, only 5% of high school students had tried marijuana. In the late 1970s, that figure rises to 40%. And so we usually think of the dawn of the drug trade as the proliferation of the hippie counterculture, and maybe the Vietnam vets returning back and partaking more marijuana. That's all on the demand side, but on the supply side, this was only made possible by the innovation of the mothership technique, because there was no way to satisfy that level of demand with ground-based transport. And so it really industrialized the drug trade and brought it into the modern era of high-capacity shipping by exploiting the mothership loophole. And so that became the dominant mode of drug transports throughout the mid to late 1970s. So, for example, if you think of the opening credits of Miami Vice, where you have these power boats speeding through the Florida Straits, that whole culture arose in order to service the mothership. So those served as pickup boats so that they could do the drug transfer mid-ocean and then outrace the Coast Guard cutters, which topped out at about 80 miles per hour. So in order to charge the mothership captain, they needed to actually witness the drug transfer happening in mid-ocean, as well as the drugs being transported to America, which was nearly impossible. And so they were only able to capture the boats that arose at shore, but they were intensely frustrated that they couldn't get at the mothership operation. And so there was one very significant drug bust in 1975, where a trawler called the Lillian B was busted with 25 tons of marijuana, as well as 12 tons in a neighboring warehouse. And at the time, that was the largest marijuana seizure in North Carolina, possibly the East Coast. But that was such a monumental seizure that the government embarked on a new program in order to intercept the mothership technique, because they were frustrated that they were only able to get at the pickup boats, but weren't really able to get at the mastermind behind the operation. And as we'll possibly get into, that was really the firing shot in the militarized war on drugs.
And Henry Kissinger's involved.
Yeah. So this is what's really fascinating. So the flagship of Derber's operation was called the Night Train, which is a fantastic name.
That's a great name.
And so this was a 165-foot cargo freighter that was delivering about 40 to 50 tons per month. Wow. And all of the maritime drug interdiction agencies, DEA, Customs, Coast Guard, State Bureau of Investigation, no one could locate the Night Train. And that was partly because Derber used a lot of sophisticated counter surveillance techniques, partly because he stayed in Cuban waters quite often, but they cannot locate the Night Train. And so the Night Train was the mothership that had supplied the Lillian B, which was busted in 1975. And there was one North Carolina customs agent who was so frustrated that they couldn't track down the Night Train that he wrote a top secret memo that proposed that they use military resources in order to locate the Night Train. And this is of huge historical significance, because this was the very first use of military resources for drug interdiction, which is why I call it the opening shot in the militarized war on drugs, because it violates, arguably, or at least the spirit of the Posse Comitatus Act, which is the Civil War era statute that prevents the use of the military for law enforcement, which is very relevant today. And the memo is so controversial that it finds its way to Henry Kissinger's desk. At the time, Henry Kissinger was the nominal interagency head for drug interdiction. He signs off on it, but it's highly classified. And it's so classified that Coast Guard officers would swear in court that the program never existed. When I did the Freedom of Information request to the DEA for any information Operation Stopgap, they replied that they destroyed all the files. And it just shows how enormously controversial at the time it was to use the military for drug interdiction. And it's important to think of that in today's context, where we're now doing missile strikes on Venezuelan drug boats and sending predator drones to Puerto Rico for drug interdiction. And so the memo proposes using Navy Grumman S-2 anti-submarine reconnaissance planes in order to locate the motherships, as well as using naval reconnaissance satellites. So it just shows the amount of resources that they need to bring to bear in order to locate the motherships. And so another justification or rationalization they used to militarize the war on drugs was also a fear, partly justified, that the Soviets were also using drugs as a ideological and financial weapon against the West. And there was a lot of obvious scaremongering about the role of the Soviets in the drug trade. But the reason I say it's not completely unjustified is in the book I detail how Derber faced a major challenge where, as he was taking his boats up from Colombia through the Windward Passage between Cuba and Hispaniola, they were being seized by the Cuban government, as well as the cargo and the crew were being seized as the motherships went into Cuban waters. And so they had a big sit down in Bogota with the Cuban ambassador to Colombia and most of the major Colombian traffickers in order to come to some sort of negotiated agreement on what to do with the motherships. And the Cuban government said, well, good news, actually. We will release the boats and the contraband and the crew. But even better news, we want to support your enterprise. We'll give you safe passage through Cuban waters. We'll provide you with refueling and maintenance services. You can fly a Cuban flag. We'll give you naval escorts, radar cover. And we only ask for two small things in return. You have to pay $800,000 docking fee. And then on the return trip, after you've dropped off all the drugs, you need to bring arms to the Marxist guerrillas in Latin America. And so this was the birth of the drugs for guns trade in the first narco-terrorism alliance of the Western Hemisphere. So my cousin Harold Derber was bringing drugs up and down the Atlantic seaboard, by the thousands of ton load. And then on the return trip, bring massive amounts of arms to the Marxist guerrillas in Colombia, in particular, M19. And what's amazing is that although he worked largely out of Colombia, his main residence is in Miami. So he's living openly on Millionaire's Row in Miami Beach with the DEA having full knowledge that he was one of the largest marijuana traffickers in the country. So the fact that he was readmitted to the country after having been deported twice, being banned from Canada, the Bahamas, Jamaica, the Caymans, Mexico, Colombia, Honduras, having served jail time in half a dozen countries. And he's readmitted to the US and then living openly as the country's largest marijuana trafficker just baffles the mind.
How does his operation come to an end?
So he, at this point, is worth an estimated $200 to $300 million in 1970s dollars, so about $2 billion in today's money.
Wow.
And he has a major challenge, as most traffickers do, on how to manage his cash. And so he becomes the cornerstone investor for a penny stock brokerage called First Jersey Securities. And through First Jersey, he's able to multiply his fortune many times over. And he begins laundering money for the Gambino crime family. At this point, it's not clear if it was a lookalike or a case of mistaken identity, but someone who resembled Harold Derber is killed by professional hitmen at a drug drop-off point in North Carolina. And I think Derber was aware of that at this stage. So he knows that there are various criminal factions circling around him. Nevertheless, he's still living openly on Miami Beach. And the SEC starts an investigation into First Jersey Securities, which is essentially a pump and dump penny stock scam. And Derber's also laundering money for the Gambino crime family through this penny stock brokerage. And he's called to testify to the SEC into this fraudulent brokerage. And the day before he's scheduled to testify, professional hitmen shoot him down in Miami outside of his condominium. The same two hitmen that had assassinated his lookalike just 5 months prior. And it's amazing because I got access to his autopsy report. I've been working very closely with the Miami Homicide Cold Case Unit, and I got access to his autopsy report, which is typically not that interesting. But there's one line that really jumped out at me where they recovered the bullet that killed him, and it's engraved with his initials. so whoever took him out were pretty serious people. And to this day, it's a mystery who killed him. If I ask his drug trafficking accomplices, they say it's the DEA. If I speak with the Miami Police Department, they say it was the Colombians. If I speak with the Colombians, they say it was the American land operators. If I speak with the American land operators, they say it was the Cubans. So it's it's similar to the Kennedy assassination, where it could have been so many people wanted him dead that it could have just been this nexus of forces working to take him out. So yeah, so hopefully I can enlist my readers to help us solve this mystery.
Do you have any idea what happened to Sari? Did she just move on with her life and she just disappeared off the radar, so to speak?
Yeah, so she's first of all, she's a really remarkable woman. Drop dead gorgeous, has an identical twin. She's most likely doing contract work for the agency while he's tied up with Cuban intelligence. So they're playing
Mhm.
this sort of cat and mouse kind of Mr. and Mrs. Smith game with each other. And when he's deported, she decides to go back to her hometown of Florida to regain custody of her three small children. And she goes on to have a really gratifying life, devoid of any tie-ups with organized crime. But I like to think that somehow she got the strength and determination through her adventures with Derber to go back and reclaim her children, start her new life. One of the most gratifying things of writing this book is that I'm discovering more and more of the people and the descendants that were part of this amazing story. And so just a few weeks ago, I was contacted by Sari's granddaughter, who shared with me some additional parts of her memoir that I didn't have access to at the time of writing the book, and that just lent even more material and adventure for the story. So it's also very much an unfolding story as I also get more material from my freedom of information requests. I have several dozen freedom of information requests still pending. I'm expecting his CIA file in the summer, hopefully, which will lend more information. But that part is really gratifying because I know in my heart of hearts that there's a further role of the US government in his story. So the fact that he had been deported twice, once as a national security risk, was living openly in Florida as the country's largest drug trafficker while running guns to Latin America tells me that there has to be a larger story here.
Yeah, I was going to ask as we wrapped everything up, what's next for this story? But it seems like it just continually progresses. Because of freedom of information requests and stuff, we never know sometimes when they're coming, or they come 2 years later, or whatever happens. You're kind of hanging on for the next part of the story.
Yeah. So some of the mysteries I want to get to the heart of are, for example, the newspaper, the Atlanta Constitution, reported a few years after his assassination that Derber was the KGB head for Miami, which sounds completely incredulous.
Yeah.
Um, but the reporter who I contacted and stands by the story said that he saw primary U.S. intelligence documents that made that claim with support. So that's one aspect I really want to get to the heart of. And the other question is, why was the government protecting him? Which they most likely were. I suspect he may have also been trafficking guns to the pro-government militias in Colombia, and so they were protecting him a little bit like an Iran-Contra arrangement. They were protecting the drug portion of his trade in order to provide cover for his gun running operations to the pro-Colombian elements in the country. So yeah, there's still some fascinating parts of the story that are waiting to be uncovered.
Yeah, it's amazing. It's amazing. I can't wait to hear more as you find it, because I'm sure you'll be screaming it from the rooftops when you find it, where it's like, "Oh, we found something amazing."
Yeah, yeah. So his NSA file is still classified. So I'm preparing a lawsuit to get access to his NSA file. And interestingly, when I did the freedom of information request for his DEA file, the agency denied my request under the exemption for methods and procedures, which I thought was very interesting. And then I wrote an appeal saying, okay, come on, guys, it was 50 years ago. The subject's deceased. It's a matter of high historical interest. They replied, oh, sorry, we destroyed all his files.
Everyone's destroying files.
Conveniently enough, yeah.
Yeah.
So yeah, so I can invite listeners to subscribe to our newsletter or visit our blog, where I'll update folks on the new information that we found.
Yeah, where can they find that information at, David, for the
Yeah,
newsletter?
so they can visit my webpage at davidtuck.com. And there you can find the link to sign up to the webpage. Follow us on Instagram, David Tuck Author, on Instagram. And yeah, and I also love hearing from readers. So if there are any questions that you have or anything that you want me to take a look at, feel free to ping me a note. I love chatting with readers.
Yeah, that's great. Everyone, it's in the chat, davidtuck.com. Please go over there and bookmark that. And don't forget, at the top of the chat pin, we have Icon Books, the publisher of The Wireless Operator. And definitely want you to check this out. It's an amazing book. It's a page turner. And I was wanting to see what he was going to get involved with next, because it just seems like it compounds and compounds as he goes through the years. And he's a hustler for sure. And
Yeah, it's so gratifying knowing, when we're, working our 9 to 5, or, doing all the mundane nonsense we have to do day to day. It's so thrilling to know that there are people out there living these unbridled lives of adventure.
yeah, yeah, it's absolutely crazy. But I really enjoyed the book, David, and I thank you so much for coming on and spending time with me.
Yeah, absolutely. It was a lot of fun. Thanks so much.
Thank you, everybody in the chat, for joining us as well. I greatly appreciate the live chat coming alive here and seeing numbers come through. And please remember to keep reading, keep throwing those questions out there, especially those research questions, and go out there and find some primary sources and find a Derber in your life. Who knows? You might find some crazy person. I've been finding prison records for a couple ancestors, and I'm like, I got to dig deeper now. So we got to see what's going on here. Take care, everyone. Be safe. Be well. Talk to you soon.